you know, to kind of understand little towns like us, you have to kind of know the significance of the important corner in town, and that's, you know, in Maquoketa was originally laid out in 4 plains. It wasn't going to be a town ever. There were little startup towns all around us, from Bridgeport and just many of them. So Maquoketa was not going to be a town. It was just a place where 4 people's claims came together. And the dividing line for those claims was Main Street, what we now know as Main Street and Platt Street. And the part that we're talking about today, the northwest corner, that was owned by a pioneer by the name of Alonzo Spalding. And like many towns, Maquoketa just developed around those 4 corners. They all kind of gathered together in that corner for convenience and for safety. And so where 4 corners came together is usually where their cabins were or their houses were, and it just grew from there. The oldest building left of the 4 corners in Maquoketa, which, as you know, is the corner of Main and Platt Street, is the Pierce Mitchell building. That's the original one that's been there the longest, and it just, I was so excited. It just had some really major tuck pointing done, and it's being really spruced up and help it last a lot longer. So I was really glad to see that. But the thing that we're going to talk about today is right across the street from the west, as you can see. And one of the earliest sources of information about this corner, okay, comes from a 1916 article in the Jackson Sentinel. And in that article, one of the old settlers had written back to the newspaper and was describing kind of a walking tour of what was where back in the day. He started at the old Decker House. Remember, the new Decker House wasn't there yet? The old white Decker House was there. And then he walked south down what is now Main Street. And the first thing he came to was a home belonging to a Mr. Hall, really prominent figure around here. He built the first bridge across the Maquoketa River. And then next to that, he said, there was a very pretty home belonging to a man by the name of George Lyon. And that's where we get the Lions block today. You know, that's the one on North Main Street with the wonderful arches up above that was recently restored. That looks so nice. My thing still doesn't work, so I have to use this, and we'll just hope that happens. So Maquoketa supposedly was started about 1838 when everything kind of began. In 1848, which is all 10 years later, David Sears from the village of Lowell came, and he looked around and he saw people gathering in this area, and he saw a great need for manufactured goods to supply the settlers and to supply the pioneers who were passing through on their way west. Some of them were staying, some of them were passing through on their way west. And one story that always comes to my mind when we talk about how they needed just common things is the story of Shad Burleson. You know, he was the man from the Buckhorn Inn. And Shad was trying to do his first plowing. He broke a bolt on his plow, and it was something that he was not able to reconstruct himself. So that man, in a 24-hour period, walked to Galena. He crossed on the ice, and he walked back to Maquoketa with his 10-cent bolt to fix his plow. He did all that in 24 hours in a cold winter, if you can imagine. So these people that were living here and gathering here, they had great needs. So like I say, David Sears, quite an entrepreneur. He was in the village of Lowell, just by the Maquoketa River, just like a mile north of town. So he purchased a lot just south of the Lions Block, so we're working our way down to the corner. And he built a frame storeroom. He was a well-to-do man because he had all the woolen mills and the grist mill and the lumber mill, etc. at Lowell. And so he made a trip back to New York, and he purchased a full line of general merchandise to bring here to start his store out. He needed a manager, so he formed a partnership with Pierce Mitchell, who owned the building that we just talked about that's being redone. And Pierce Mitchell ran that store for a year. And after that time, he built his building across the street and started his own business. Well, at that time, Benjamin, his father, was here with him, and so Benjamin ran the store for a while. David's sons then operated the businesses. One of them managed all the mills at Lowell, and the other one managed all of their farms that they had managed to accumulate and start. And this was all under the watchful eye of David Sears. Later, the old Sears building, when they didn't need it for a general store, because others had sprung up, was rented as a furniture store. And so they kind of had their first furniture store. We know that for a while there was a small barber shop nearby, but the first store that we can hear tell of that was located on that corner at 100 North Main Street was a low one-story frame building, and it too was a general store belonging to Isaac and Charles Hall. Well, it wasn't until 1876, and that's the same year that the new Decker house was built right beside the old Decker house, as you'll remember, 1876, that John Harris erected this large brick building that's still standing on the corner there. About the same time, and you'll see his blacksmith shop here. John Harris had the novelty carriage works. Usually people who made and sold carriages were blacksmiths, so that was kind of right to the west. But at the same time, when he built this large brick building that still stands on the northwest corner of Main and Platt Street, a man by the name of H.B. French built a one-story building to the north. And the Harris building was said in all the newspapers, etc., that to be the best constructed and most handsome building in the city. It had 2 stories, and the second story extended over the top of the one-story building that French had just built. And so that way he combined the 2 upstairs as Harris did, and that was the Opera House. It was in his building and the upper half of the other building. And we find that that happened back then quite a bit. It seems very strange to us today, because you just don't build something on top of somebody else's building today. But back then they did. So the combined upstairs was the Opera House, and down below was the Baugh & Company drugstore and something called Stadler's Clock, Watch, and Jewelry Store, and they were on the ground floor. So that was the first thing in the building that, so we're talking about the building now where the Mexican restaurant is, right? Just so everybody's on the same page. Okay, so there was the Harris Opera House. And in our collection we have these things. We have a ticket to that. The Opera House was a very metropolitan playhouse for its day. Now think of this. It had seating for 800 people at a time when Maquoketa's population was only 3,500. That's pretty good. They advertised, as you can see, that they had a large stage, a full set of scenes. It was well lighted and well ventilated. And I don't know what it's like right now, but until its most recent renovation, when they put apartments above the Mexican restaurant, there were still signatures up there on the walls of a lot of the artists and people who had performed there through the years. Those were still written on the walls. Also in our collection, get this out of there. Also in the collection, we have a couple of handbills that came from the Harris Opera House at the time. And this one shows that they were having a concert by the Rivals. And it does say it was November 18th, but they don't tell us what year it was. That's always a problem. So we do have in our other museum, we have a really nice exhibit of opera houses and things like that. From the Harris Opera House, we have a large trunk that they used as they traveled along from opera house giving their performances. And this is a violin. And I've always hoped to get a grant and have this violin restored. Never quite got there, so if anybody's interested, I think that could be done. It's just a wonderful old instrument, but it definitely needs a little tender, loving care. But we know that this violin belonged to a gal by the name of Ida Mae Harris. She was a relative of the Harrises that owned the Opera House. She was quite a performer. She traveled a lot. She performed in chautauquas and other things like that. So those are kind of the things that we have from the Harris Opera House. But for a tiny little, not quite even a village yet, to have something like that was really quite something. So we went along for another about 10 years, I believe, when this man, well, it's kind of confusing. There's William M. Stevens and there's William H. Stevens. So in 1866, William, and I don't know how they're related, I just know they're related. And I'm assuming they're probably brothers. William H. Stevens decided to retire from a very successful mercantile business. Okay, 1886, remember, at that time he had stores in Strawberry Point and Lanark, Illinois. And by this time he owned the old stone store that was across the street, on another historic corner across the street where Mavis Splash is now. He owned that old building. And either he or William H. Stevens, and why I can't figure out which, I don't know, lived in this beautiful house. You can see that it was on South Niagara Street, very, very successful. So he had the first banking room, which was in the Stevens block. And so this is one of the circus parades in Maquoketa back in the day, and you can see off to the side, you can see the awning that says, that lists the bank, Maquoketa State Savings Bank. The Stevens block actually burned in the disastrous fire of 1915, but he had moved from there by then. Because he then purchased the Harris property that we've been talking about, the Harris Opera House on the northwest corner of Platt and Main Street, and he moved his banking room there. And then it became the Stevens Opera House, right? Harris Opera House became the Stevens Opera House. So according to all the information that we can find, in the 1890s, Maquoketa had 3,500 residents. And they were happy and doing well and optimistic about the future, and they were people that had the time to enjoy art and culture. And the Harris Opera House, that had become the Stevens Opera House, was a main part of all of this. And there was much drama at the Stevens Opera House. And this is the good kind of drama, not the drama we sometimes talk about.
What's the population right now?
6,000. Right at 6,000.
About half.
Yep. Yep. And so the Opera House had just opened its doors. Just to kind of give you an idea, it cost a quarter, a lot of money back then. It cost a quarter to go to a play like Madame Butterfly or Rip Van Winkle. And one of the performers that they had often were the Cherry Sisters. I don't know how many of you remember hearing about the Cherry Sisters, but they were quite something. They were really a well-known theatrical act. They were sisters. There were 5 of them originally that performed together, and 2 of them kind of, I think one passed away, and one retired, and so for a long time there were 3. And they were famous not so much for their talent, but for their lack of talent, right? They were from Marion, Iowa, and like I say, their act was less than talented, and yet they were popular. And they ended up more infamous than famous. But they performed all around the country, and this is what is so amazing. They would go on stage, they would be pelted with fruits and vegetables. People would throw rotten tomatoes. I mean, and this is what they were known for. And on occasion, riots even broke out. And during one performance in Dubuque, they faced down hecklers with a loaded shotgun after facing missiles of shoes and raw meat. Back then, to throw raw meat was considered, quite something. And it was quite something. And so they performed here often. But despite all of this, the 3 sisters, the Cherry Sisters, were paid up to $1,000 a week. A lot of money back then, right? And that's right. And reportedly, and this has been in many New York newspapers, reportedly they saved the Hammerstein Theater in New York from bankruptcy because their appearances there drew huge crowds, and they helped them over a rough spot. The interesting thing is that these three sisters, or five sisters to begin with, truly believed that they were talented. They weren't just, you know, a Phyllis Diller kind of act out there. They really believed that they had talent. They had been taught by their father that they descended from royalty, that they were talented theatrically, and they took themselves very seriously. So they were quite the performers. And there's been a couple, since they were from Marion and then they lived in Cedar Rapids, none of the sisters ever married. There have been a couple research papers, maybe a book written about them, so all this is really well documented. Okay, so here we see what, we're back to our corner again, and we see that on the lower level of the Stevens property, where the Opera House up above, it became the Jackson County Bank. Under the sign, Jackson County Bank. So the Jackson County Bank was a private bank. Back then, there were banking rooms. The banks were not what we think of as a bank today. This was the private bank of William H. Stevens. He was the owner. He owned the bank. Hosea Goodnow was the president, and William M. Stevens, and again, I don't know how they're connected, was the cashier. And they started out with a capital and a surplus of $67,500. That's how they started their bank. But then in October of 1904, it became Jackson Savings Bank, and William H. was the president. And then among the directors were William M. and Adam Ringlup. We all know him from Ringlup's Hardware. And then R.E. Stevens, who was W.M. Stevens' son. So,
okay.
I'm confused, yes. They were the Stevens family. Okay, so, but you can see how beautiful and how wonderful this building is. And then this is the Lions Block, right here, with the windows that we talked about. Where's Judy? Is that any relation?
I don't think it is.
You don't think it
I always
is?
thought it would have been cool if our brewery would have been in that building.
Absolutely, yeah. But we like it right where it is.
Yeah.
It's pretty nice. Okay, so these old pictures are just really interesting. We know that this little building right here, eventually at least, became the Hamley Photographic Studio of Arch Hamley for a while. And but there you see this awesome building that is still there today. And maybe I have to go one more. Okay, so then this is a little bit later picture. We think that it's 1904. It says 1900, okay. The window reads Jackson State Savings Bank, I believe. No, I'm on the wrong picture, so next picture. Okay, if you look at this picture, this little sign right here, okay, I believe it says Excelsior newspaper. That's where the Excelsior newspaper offices were upstairs for a while. So that tells us by then, the Opera House must have been gone. We know that there was other opera houses, the Grand Opera House, further down on South Main Street. So by then, it was gone. And then we have the picture, this picture. Okay. This photograph must be after December of 1905. It's now Jackson State Savings Bank. It was then, you know, it was then Jackson County Bank, which was the private bank of W.M. Stevens. And then they transferred their business to Jackson State Savings Bank, and so they kind of combined. So it was in 1920 that R.E. Stevens, we know he was the son, wanted to resign. He wanted to resign. I don't know whether he wanted to retire, he wanted to do something else or what, but he wanted to resign. And he tendered his resignation. And at that time, the stockholders of this bank refused to accept his resignation. And so he stayed on, and he was at the bank for a long time. Jackson State Savings Bank was part of the bank holiday in 1933. It was, of course, a dark, dark time for our country. It was a time when all of the banks were requested by the mayors of every little town and every little city in Jackson County to close. So they closed. Did they all close, Roger? They all closed for a while. And then this bank reopened with but they reopened only because the employees agreed to have their salaries cut in half so that they could lighten their operating expenses. But this bank reopened. There were 3 other banks in Maquoketa at the time, and those banks never reopened. So of the only, I'm going to sneeze, I'm sorry. Only 3 banks in the county actually made it through the Great Depression, right? Jackson State Savings Bank, I'm waiting for Roger to nod at me so I'm on the right track here. Jackson State Savings Bank, I believe the Baldwin Bank, and maybe the Spragueville Bank, were those the 3. Out of all the banks in all of Jackson County, and there were a lot, really, you'd be surprised at how many, those are the only 3 banks that made it through the Great Depression. Roger?
It's just kind of interesting that in those small towns, Baldwin and Spragueville, they had enough wherewithal to keep open. It was quite an accomplishment.
I would think so. And I did read, and you tell me if this is right, I did read that one of the reasons that the bank we're looking at made it through was because they were the smallest of all the banks, and they had decided to become very conservative, and they had kind of cut back, and so that was one of the other reasons. They weren't overextended, maybe is that a way to put it, so that they were able to make it through. But that's just a miraculous accomplishment done.
2 things. The Spragueville Bank remained open because of the Strohmeyer money.
Okay.
The Strohmeyer family gave them enough money to stay
Really?
afloat. And that was the first time they did that. There was another time later when there was an embezzlement, and the Strohmeyers then gave enough money to keep the bank open.
Wow, thank you for that.
Also, the banks that closed were banks, they were older banks that had a lot of money lent on land, high-priced land. But when the property prices collapsed, everybody went under on their mortgage, and the banks couldn't survive.
And the banks couldn't survive.
Too much out on
That's
land.
right. So that's why these smaller, more conservative banks that didn't have so much money invested out there made it through, I guess.
Bonnie, wasn't there a bank across the street to the north too, in that corner?
Across the street to the east, there was a bank. First National was upstairs in the Pierce
No,
Mitchell
up on the
building.
next, across the street.
The American Savings Bank.
Thank you.
Yeah, but that was,
Make a splash.
no, that's true.
But
I
did
didn't
it
know
go
that's what you
kaput
mean.
then?
Yes, it did. And it was only open for maybe 11 years. It opened in 1921.
Oh.
And in 1933, I guess, it was
Okay,
never able to
okay.
open again. Roger?
Well, that bank was interesting because the building was completely new.
It
And one of
was.
the things that happened was they bought this, or got this huge vault, theoretically, that they thought that would make them a good bank, but the vault didn't help them that much.
Didn't help that much. And it was a shame because that was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful bank.
Yeah.
So thank you for all of that. These are always fact-finding tours, you know, so I appreciate everybody's comment.
One of the reasons that the American Bank closed was because they were a newer bank, and they were one of the first ones to experience a huge run.
Oh.
Oh.
So they didn't have enough behind them, you know, to do that. They didn't have the money lent out on mortgages.
They just,
Didn't, when everybody
Right.
went through their money, when they closed, my grandma Edna and her sisters each had $800 in an account, each account, and they lost that money.
And they lost
because
it all.
The bank closed.
yeah, thank you, Don. Roger?
Just one more thing.
You
In
bet.
the Baldwin Savings Bank, my grandfather was one of the original directors of
Uh-huh.
the Tabor.
For the Tabors.
So did the Tabors give money to the bank like the Spragueville people did, or?
I have no idea.
Okay. So, hopefully I'm on the right picture here now. Okay, so things went along, we made it through the Depression, the war ended, things got better. In 1938, Jackson State Savings Bank then purchased Maquoketa Bank and Trust at 120 South Main Street. You know, the beautiful white terracotta bank in the middle of the block that had closed, and because it just didn't make it through, and so it had closed. So they purchased the old bank, and they moved there. And so the whole bank moved, and it continued to grow, and it just did wonderfully for years. So the old bank building that we see right here on the corner, what happened to that? Well, they sold it. And the people who bought it were Frank Carson, John L. Jones, Everett Schinthaler, and Hillis Lee. Those are all names I know that we have heard before. So upstairs then in this building were the Schinthaler and Lee law offices. And I think John L. Jones was an insurance man, correct? So his insurance office was up there. And then on the ground floor, they set up the Carson Pharmacy. And I bet most of you remember the Carson Pharmacy. It was there for a very long time, and it was wonderful. And there's the Carson drugstore on the corner of Main and Platt Street.
What year are we talking about that Carson's bought it?
1938.
Thank you.
1938, you bet. So they were there a very long time. But they're just wonderful, wonderful old pictures of this great building.
I don't have that one.
One more thing.
Please, Roger,
And,
lots of things, please.
I have a postcard of that building, vintage, when it was when it was a bank, but it was glossy, and it's a very nice picture. It was just, I don't know where it came from, but I've got it.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, it's just amazing how those wonderful old picture postcards have, you know, come down through history. They tell us so much, and now you couldn't buy one if you wanted. They just don't do that anymore. And it's really sad, because they were really wonderful and have contributed mightily to our situation. Okay, any more please, I love all your comments. Anybody else? Don?
Can we go back one?
Maybe.
Okay, so that picture would be probably more like 1920s rather than just after 1905.
Well, I see what you're saying. I see the car, etc., and I thought about that a lot. So I took the dates from, and I didn't bring the book down with me, but the book, the First National Bank book written by Louis Lane, right?
Right.
I followed that timeline really closely as to the names that were on the banks, and that's how I came up with the dates, because our pictures didn't have dates.
Right, but it was definitely after 1905, but I was also going to mention that the little side downstairs,
Right here,
next, right there.
there,
No, the other way. In the
Oh,
car,
here.
Here. That was a grocery store.
Hoffman's
Hoffman's
grocery
yeah.
store.
Yeah.
And remember, this was a separate property, I guess, from this. And that seems very strange to us today, but
Oh, so that was the part that was bought and built over?
built
Oh,
over,
I thought it
yes.
was behind.
This was built by French. And then at the same time he was building this, so he just built it right across the top. The same thing happened with the Harrison Brothers furniture store and mortuary undertaking store. They had a downstairs, you know, a downstairs ground level retail store for all of their things that was just one lot. And then they owned 3 store tops up above. And they owned them. It was a legal thing. It belonged to them.
Is that the place that was recently the beauty shop down below and it's closed in the?
I don't know that. Does anybody know that? Was there a beauty shop down there?
Yeah.
There was a barber shop?
Or is this the place that's the?
Isn't this the
where they
Mexican
sell-
restaurant?
Yes, it is.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's the Mexican
This
restaurant.
is the Mexican restaurant.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Fullerton's owned it.
Yes, I recognize that name. Nancy,
So did they whitewash the building in that point in time too? Because wasn't it?
they stuccoed it, yes, to stabilize the brick, et cetera, et
Instead of
cetera,
tucking
right.
it, probably.
And
It was called the Barbers, I think.
The upstairs double.
I don't know if they ever owned the building or not.
where were they?
The black one was sold out.
So we know there was a barber shop in the basement for a long time, and we know that it belonged to Jim Gibson. Because a lot of times, I'm sorry, I can't control this thing. A lot of times there were the barber shops, the beauty shops, and things were in the basement.
And one of your slides showed that sidewalk that went down.
That went down.
From this, yes. And I think right there, maybe that's the same thing too. But someday we'll repeat the brown bag lunch of when the city was taking up the sidewalks and uncovered all the rooms down below, and they called Don and they called me and they wanted to know, what is this? Well, we weren't surprised, but they didn't know that there were all these things downstairs. And so we have some pretty good pictures of those, so we'll look at those again.
You should put that into your rotation.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll do that. Since I'm desperate for programs,
Exactly, right.
we will do that. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, so this is again what many of you remember with Shintaler and Lee upstairs, and just this wonderful old building. And notice the glass blocks across here, because you're going to see those again in a little bit. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures. This is supposedly 1950, and it was a common sight on this corner in 1950, on our historic northwest corner of Main and Platt Street, because the Salvation Army was there all the time. One of the reasons, I believe, was that the Salvation Army Citadel wasn't far away, just kind of a kitty corner block, because it was on James Street, right behind the post office, sort of.
Right.
And that's really an important thing in our history, I think, because it was the first Salvation Army Citadel west of the Mississippi, the very first one. Another reason I think that they kind of hung out on this corner with their music and was because Everett Shintaler, who was up above and owner of the building, was a huge supporter of the Salvation Army. And so I think they felt very comfortable with him. So I don't know if any of you remember, do you remember going by this corner in the 50s? Salvation Army? All right. Don?
Is that a drinking fountain?
It is. But somebody's hat's sitting on it.
Oh, it is.
Must not be
The first drinking fountains in Macocata were put in 1927, I believe.
That's not.
The first two.
Well,
I just found it in the paper, so
what
that's how I
about
know.
Dr.
Dobson?
A.B. Dobson? He put drinking fountains in
And
before
horse
then.
and horse trough.
And horse troughs. So I don't think they could have been the first. Probably the
That's
most
just what I
modern.
found in the paper, so.
Yep. But we know that A.B. Dobson, Dr. Dobson, remember he was the spiritualist that never saw a patient, but became extremely rich because you would send him an envelope with $1, a lock of hair, and a little card that said what your ailment was, what's wrong with you. And he would have a seance over this with several people that helped him. He was a medium, I guess. And he would send back a bottle of his elixir, or snake oil, and he would diagnose, he would tell you what was wrong with you, diagnose your condition, and give you advice. And he became extremely wealthy, and at one time, he owned 17 of the brick building blocks in Macocata.
Wow.
And he's the one that built the Dobson building that's still standing,
New Era building.
the new era building, the town clock was on that building. He built and owned that. But he did amazing things for Macocata. I'm not sure how many people he cured, but he did amazing things. Judy?
This, not to do the picture directly, but on the east side of the street, you can see which is across from the brewery, so I've been really watching it, but they've
Okay.
been redoing the facades, and they've
Yes.
got that all painted so nice, the really tall building that's kind of in the middle there. Make sure you take a look at it. It's just turning out so
Well, the
beautiful.
Macokota downtown was
Yes.
fantastic.
Right.
They're doing
It's
a
really
great
been
job.
wonderful to watch, because it was pretty ugly there for a
Right,
while.
and I was so grateful to see the top pointing that was being done on the Pierce Mitchell building, because that, if you ever stopped and looked up there, it was getting pretty deteriorated. I mean, it almost felt like, do I want to even walk down that side of the street, you know? So I was so glad to see that. It is looking really, really good. All right. Okay, so a lot of us will remember when the street looked like this. Do you remember when the stop signs were in the middle of the street? And look at that busy little thing right there. So those were, I guess, the good old days.
I think it's so interesting in this one, that little pointed roof building is gone, and those nice buildings in between the two-story buildings have been renovated so beautifully by this
Right.
time.
Right here, you mean?
Yes.
Yep, absolutely. There's so much to be learned from these. Don?
If you can point out the Lions building again.
Okay, right here.
So, in the 50s, that was a youth center upstairs.
Oh, it was.
And
I was there.
I have a picture of somebody in this room dancing in that little youth center upstairs. And Roger's laughing right now because he knows what I'm talking about.
I wasn't a very good dancer, but it was a youth center, and we
It
always
was.
went up those stairs to the second level, and they would have little bands come, but it was
Yeah,
well
it's pretty
attended.
nice.
And that's why Roger's always nice to me.
There's a picture of Black Miller with a picture. Oh, gosh. Okay, so take a look again at Carson's Drugstore, because this is what we're going to start talking about, and those little glass bricks there, okay? And remember, now I think this is right. At one point, each of the stores on each of the corners on this historic corner had this little entry. It was, kind of a triangle thing, and you would walk through. The Mexican restaurant still has theirs. Vegas Fry still has theirs, right? But I think the other two are gone. Is that correct? And I just kind of wish they were all still there, but nobody asked me. Nobody ever does. Done?
Correct me if I'm mistaken, but before the youth center was there, wasn't that upstairs where they presented Captain Drips or Captain Kelsey his sword?
The GAR building? Is that where the GAR was?
Possibly, but we have a picture of them presenting, and I thought it was in that building or in that location.
Oh, I'll have to take a look at that. I don't know that for sure, but that's interesting. Okay. All right. So, one of the reasons that we're talking about this today is because some time ago we were presented with 2 boxes of slides. Both boxes said Carson Drugstore, and both boxes said 1960. They had postmarks, 1960 on them. So they just kind of have been around, so we decided it was time to do something with them. So we're gonna look at them. I thought because there were 2 boxes and they were just alike, they were probably the same slides, the same pictures. But almost all of them were different. So altogether there were, I believe, 43 different slides. We're not gonna look at every one of them. Keep in mind that this was 1960. They've deteriorated. Some of them are really dark, so I've tried to lighten them up and make them look a little better, and I'm not the best at that. But how grateful we are to remember what the inside of Carson's Drugstore looked like, because it was so important to all of us, and so to a lot of us. So everybody remembers the Raspberry Bar, right? I'm sure Roger spent time at the Raspberry Bar. Everybody went there for their little morning coffees or whatever, and you can see that. You can see the Coke machine there, and the soda fountains, and so that was the Raspberry Bar that you hear about. So we're just going to look at those now. I will tell you that one of the boxes came from the Buckners. It was addressed to Jim Buckner, who was a pharmacist, right, at the Carson's drugstore. And the other one, the other box, I don't know where they came from. But anyway, just, so if there's anything you want to look at, just holler. Whoops, this is really hard to. Okay, so this is another view of the Raspberry Bar.
Where did that name come from, do you know?
Does anybody know? I don't know. Do you know, Roger? Does anybody know where the name Raspberry Bar came from? I think the fact that they spelled it with 2 Z's is significant. That's kind of fun, right? And it just ended up, as you'll see maybe at the end, that it came to be a fun place. A place where business people, well, all people in Maquoketa gathered, and they just, you know, were comrades. Camaraderie is what it was.
The chairs are kind of that raspberry color, maybe.
Yep, they are.
Was
They
the
are.
bar for alcohol or just?
No,
No.
I don't think so.
No.
It was a soda fountain bar.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, soda fountain, and people would go and get their morning coffee. Did they have food other than ice cream? I don't think so. I think it was just a
I think
a
it's just
soda
They
snacks.
had
Snacks is what I see.
fountain. Okay, yeah, there is a salt shaker.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if they had French fries, right?
Chips.
So just a lot to be seen in these pictures. But I just picked out a few of them to show you. This one, I don't know why, this is the only one that was black and white, or whether it was just me, I don't know. But I didn't know if anybody could recognize this man. 1960. So don't know who that is. So is that the tobacco area?
Yes.
With all the cigarettes and all the cigars and all the everything. And we have a lot of those things. We have, at the museum, we have some artifacts from there. And we have a lot of things, but one of the things that came to us lately, and Dennis Summit, Dennis voiced things, does anybody remember, and I should have brought it down, does anybody remember the little, they were like a punch card, and they were about so big, and they were thick, and they had kind of a foil, and you would pay so much money, and then you would punch a hole, and a little tiny piece of white paper you could take out, and you could open it up, and it was worth so much on cigarettes or something like that. Those punch cards. It's really, do you remember those?
I remember punch cards, but not necessarily there, but I do remember that little piece of paper.
Paper that would come out. Yeah. Not quite sure, even looking at the one that just came in, I'm not quite sure how that worked. But they were really, really popular. Or maybe for every pack of cigarettes you bought, you got 1 punch, or I'm not sure how they worked.
I remember being a really little girl, and my grandpa had velvet tobacco in that tin can.
Yes,
And that
yes.
little skinny one, and then he'd roll his cigarettes and lick the paper.
And lick the paper. Oh, gosh. Does anybody know who this gentleman is?
Sure a good picture of him.
It is, isn't it? For 1960, these are old, but they... Sorry, I have trouble with this thing. And there's a few more of their, this is kind of from the back corner, kind of inside the bar looking out. But look at the merchandise that they have in that store. I mean, man, they had stuff, didn't they?
They have bowling bags way
Yeah.
on top.
Okay, what else do you see? Yes, you're right. You know, they, in their advertisement, pharmacies or drugstores sold paint, they sold wallpaper, they sold all kinds of things back then. Yeah, like Snow White.
That kind of a transition from general store to this. I mean,
Yeah.
they probably didn't have a lot of general stores at
Yeah.
that point. That kind of transitional thing.
But you can look at these pictures and just see all kinds of neat things. Now I assume that this is the pharmacy with the actual drugs. Don't know who this lady is. But evidently she's filling a prescription. Be fun to read some of those bottles. I know that some of the things that they gave to the Historical Society at the other building, some of the things they used were arsenic. I mean, that was a common thing that they used. And what was the other one that's poison? Arsenic and
Strychnine.
What was it for?
Yeah, I'm sorry?
What was it for?
I don't know what they use it for, do you know, John? Arthritis.
Arthritis,
Yeah,
dysentery.
yeah, they didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have the wonderful things that we have now, and so some of the things that they used just, you know, kind of make you wonder now how they lived so long. Or maybe that's why they didn't, I don't know. Okay, so there's another, these must be toothbrushes? I know I looked at these, you think I remember.
Dr. West, yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. West.
Yeah.
I think this is a refrigerator that we see every now and then. Must have kept some of the drugs that had to be refrigerated. But just lots and lots of different things. Oops, sorry. But wow, did they carry a lot of merchandise. Can you imagine working there and having to know where each and everything was?
Can you imagine doing inventory?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Look at all the bandits.
Yeah. Yeah, you just see all kinds of things. And I'm not able to here, but when you expand these pictures and blow them up before they get blurry, you can read a lot of the labels, and it's just kind of amazing. Like I saw one screen, I don't know if I put it in here, with the different kinds of gum that they used to have. There was blackjack and anise. Who remembers some of the others?
Yeah.
Juicy fruit?
Juicy fruit, yeah. Dente.
Double mint.
Cloves, yeah. So some of the really old things that you can only find in special places these days. And again, there's the old Coca-Cola thing. But you can see the lamp. Now, I'm guessing that these pictures, photographs, slides, were not professionally done. The lights are kind of a problem. They kind of, this is the beauty bar. I don't think you can read it, but it says beauty bar across here. So that's where the evening Paris was and different things like that, I think. But, and again, there's the glass block. So that must, I think that's the Main Street side, yeah. So just really interesting to see these old pictures. Okay, so this is one of the, was not one of them. This is one that had been in our collection. But you see some of the people that were working there. Sally Martin, Muller, Millie Reynolds, Fisher, Betty Streff, that was Mark Streff's mom. Danny Harrington, Edward Bowling, Frank Carson, and Eva Carson are there. But pretty neat. And those are that's some of their stationaries from back then, because I had trouble figuring out whether it was Carson's Pharmacy or Carson's Drugstore, or what did they really call it? But this is their letterhead, and so I guess that I think was it. And then we have one final memory. That's it today. We have one thing I just wanted to read to you that's kind of funny. One last memory of the Raspberry Bar. Okay. This is a letter that was sent by Don Wolf in 1999 back to Dennis Boy when he was doing his radio things. So this is what he said. Hi Dennis, I see many references to the soda coffee bar at Carson's Drugstore. It was called the Raspberry Bar, and many deals, plots, jokes, etc. were instigated there. I would like to tell you about one. I won't name the instigators of the joke, as some are still alive. It was in the late 50s or early 60s, I'm not sure that's exactly right. Brent Wells, who's my brother, built a house on the Seven Hills Road. It was one of those modular homes that had rooms sticking out over the foundation, and rooms just sticking out all over. And someone thought that this one, jotted out more than the rest, looked like an outhouse. So one time they cut, painted, and pasted a crescent moon and some stars on the door. He says, Brent never said a word to anyone, but one morning, he had an old car parked on North Main Street, around the corner from Carson's in the Raspberry Bar. And inside the car, there were 2 or 3 unsavory-looking fellows. They were in there with hats pulled low over their faces. They had an outlook posted over on the corner of the Maid-Right, because the kitty corner was the Maid-Right, remember? And when he saw Bob Keeley and Graham Moyer coming up West Platt Street to Carson's for their morning coffee, he signaled to Brent. Brent then came around the corner squealing the tires, motor roaring, and a tape recorder playing a machine gun firing. Brent had made a gun out of compressed air tank, and he had the barrel packed with white flour. When he got even with Keeley and Moyer, he filled them full of flour. When they walked into Carson's, they were as white as sheets, and I don't think that all of it was flour. Keeley couldn't understand why anybody would do such a thing to a guy such as nice as he, and Moyer, who was just at the piece at the time, thought that maybe somebody that he had sent to the pen was trying to get even. But this is just another Raspberry Bar legend. So it just kind of tells you the kind of fun that they had there, and I bet Roger has some more stories about the Raspberry Bar, but it must have been quite a place. That and the Green Mill, I think, were what made Makokata back in the day. So if anyone has anything else to add, any stories about the building?
Remember when it was the Victoria's restaurant?
Yes.
No,
Yes, I remember.
Victoria's Restaurant. Oh, and the other thing I need to ask, it was a pizzeria after that. It was Cristino's Pizzeria, but it was somebody else's pizza place before that. Okay.
But Christine wasn't, they didn't have that very often, Victoria's. This was very long.
Okay.
Victoria Keeley.
Okay, and then there was another pizza place before Cristino's, but I can't remember the name. And then, of course, after that, it's been the Mexican restaurant from some time now. And the Mexican restaurant has had 3 owners, I believe, in the time that it's been a Mexican restaurant. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for all your input. That was, thank you.